Ridgeland Hall House in Charleston, South Carolina, carries a haunting history tied to maritime tragedies and mysterious deaths within its walls. According to local lore, the house has been the site of strange occurrences that echo the untimely deaths of those linked to shipwrecks and oceanic disasters. Visitors often report ghostly apparitions, faint sounds of ship bells, and the eerie scent of seawater within the rooms, as if the ocean has imprinted itself on the house. One of the most famous spirits said to linger at Ridgeland Hall is that of a young sailor whose ship met a tragic fate off the coast. People claim to see him staring out of windows facing the sea, perhaps waiting for a ship that never returned. There are also tales of a woman in period clothing wandering the halls, said to be a bride who lost her fiancé to the same maritime disaster, her sorrow bound to the house. The house remains a popular destination for paranormal investigators and thrill-seekers who hope to catch a glimpse of these spirits or experience the chilling atmosphere that has defined Ridgeland Hall for centuries. As the legend goes, Ridgeland Hall was built in the early 1800s by a wealthy shipping merchant who had prospered greatly from the Charleston harbor trade routes. Lavish parties filled its halls, and it became a grand symbol of success in the bustling coastal town. However, beneath the elegance lay a shadowy history, a string of accidents, disappearances, and tragedies that left many wondering if the hall was cursed. One fateful night, a storm rolled in from the Atlantic, fierce and relentless. A ship belonging to the merchant, the Carolina Star, struggled against the raging waves. Many said the merchant's only son, a promising young sailor, was aboard, tasked with transporting precious cargo back to Charleston. But as the storm peaked, the Carolina Star never returned. Some claimed to hear its crew's faint cries carried by the wind, only to die away in the crashing surf. The merchant was never the same, and he retreated into his mansion, growing colder and more distant, haunted by loss. Soon after the Carolina Star vanished, strange happenings began to plague Ridgeland Hall. Servants reported hearing footsteps echoing through empty corridors, accompanied by a wet, salty breeze, even on the calmest days. Windows would open mysteriously at night, letting in the smell of seawater. Some swore they saw the silhouette of a sailor wandering the grounds or felt an inexplicable chill as if touched by a ghostly hand. Years later, when the merchant himself passed under mysterious circumstances found cold and pale in his study, as if drained of life, the townsfolk grew convinced that Ridgeland Hall was cursed by the spirits of those lost to the sea. The mansion was eventually abandoned by his heirs, who feared the restless spirits within. Ridgeland Hall stood empty for decades, a decaying relic on the edge of Charleston, until a new family, oblivious to its dark history, moved in. The new owners, the Callaways, were delighted by the grandeur of the old house. But soon, they too began experiencing unexplainable phenomena. Late one evening, Mrs. Callaway, who had been in the library alone, heard what sounded like whispers just behind her, a murmuring, unintelligible and distorted, as though carried across a great distance. She turned, expecting her husband, only to find no one there. When she mentioned it to him later, he confessed to hearing strange sounds too, especially at night. One stormy night, just as Mrs. Callaway was about to go to bed, she caught sight of something in the hall mirror. As Mrs. Callaway glanced into the hall mirror, she froze, her heart pounding as she saw a figure reflected beside her, a young man dressed in an old-fashioned sailor's uniform, his face pale and waterlogged, with hollow eyes fixed on her. She spun around, but the hall was empty. Shaken, she dismissed it as her imagination, but the vision left her feeling as if an unseen presence lingered in the room, watching her. Over the following days, the haunting became more insistent. Mr. Callaway would return from work to find wet footprints trailing through the corridors, although no one else had entered the house. Doors would creak open slowly, as though guided by an invisible hand, and the low sound of sobbing echoed from the walls, often near the windows that looked out toward the sea. The Callaways' young daughter, Clara, started talking to the sad man, describing him with unsettling accuracy. A sailor with salt-crusted hair and sad eyes, she said he would stand by her bed at night, telling her stories of ships lost at sea, tales of a long journey he could never complete. Concerned, Mr. Callaway decided to investigate the house's history, hoping to uncover some logical explanation. At the town's library, he pored over records, piecing together the tragic fate of the original merchant's son, lost on the Carolina Star, and the string of strange events that had plagued the house ever since. He learned that after the ship's disappearance, the merchant himself became obsessed with trying to communicate with his son. Locals recalled him holding seances in Ridgeland Hall, attempting to contact the spirit of his lost heir. Many believed he had opened a doorway he couldn't close, inviting the spirits of those lost at sea into his home. Desperate to find peace for their family, the Callaways brought in a local medium, an elderly woman who had long been rumored to have the sight. As she entered Ridgeland Hall, she grew visibly tense, her eyes scanning the rooms with an anxious intensity. "They are trapped here," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the staircase. "Lost souls, bound to this house by grief and longing." That evening, the medium conducted a ritual, lighting candles in each room to guide the lost ones back to the sea. The Callaways waited with bated breath as she walked through the house, murmuring prayers and sprinkling salt near windows and doorways. But as midnight approached, a violent storm suddenly erupted outside, rattling the windows and doors as though the very house resisted the ritual. Just as the medium finished her last incantation, a piercing wail filled the hall, echoing through the air like the last cry of a drowning sailor. In that moment, Mrs. Callaway felt a deep chill, as though the temperature had dropped suddenly. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and she heard the faint sound of waves crashing, as if the ocean itself had seeped into the walls of Ridgeland Hall. The family gathered together in the living room, holding each other tightly as the medium continued her chants, her voice rising above the storm's fury. And then, Clara whispered, "He's here. He says he doesn't want to leave alone. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The room fell silent as Clara's words hung in the air, sending a shiver through everyone. Mrs. Callaway held her daughter close, her heart racing. The medium's face turned pale, but her voice grew stronger, repeating words in an ancient dialect, calling upon the sea to take back its lost souls. The wailing seemed to ebb, only to rise again, louder and closer, as if the very walls of Ridgeland Hall were crying out. Then, just as suddenly, a fierce gust of wind blasted through the room, extinguishing the candles in a single chilling breath. Shadows thickened, stretching along the walls, and the scent of brine filled the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara looked up at her mother, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were seeing something far beyond the room. "He says he's been waiting for someone," she whispered, "waiting for someone to help him find his way home." The medium, visibly shaken, clutched her amulet and muttered an urgent prayer. She reached for Clara's hand, as though sensing that the child had become some kind of link to the spirits haunting Ridgeland Hall. Clara looked at her, a distant expression in her young eyes, and then, as if in a trance, she began to walk toward the grand staircase, her steps steady and sure. "Clara!" Mrs. Callaway called, her voice strained with panic. But Clara didn't respond, her gaze fixed forward, guided by an unseen force. The family followed her, their fear growing with each step, as she led them up the staircase and down a narrow hallway they'd rarely used, stopping in front of a locked door they had never managed to open. As they stood in tense silence, the old lock creaked, and the door swung open, revealing a small, dust-covered room with a single window that looked out toward the ocean. The air in the room was thick, almost alive, and as they stepped inside, they felt a strange pressure settle over them. At the center of the room, there was a large, antique mirror, its glass darkened with age. Clara stood before it, transfixed. "He's here," she whispered again, reaching out to touch the mirror's surface. As her fingers met the glass, a ripple spread across it, as if she'd touched the surface of water. Everyone held their breath, staring as a misty figure began to take shape within the mirror, a sailor, with sorrow etched deeply into his ghostly face, his gaze distant and weary. He seemed to be reaching out, his hand pressed against the other side of the glass. The room felt colder, as though a shadow had blanketed it in ice. The family watched in terrified awe as the figure within the mirror grew clearer, his eyes dark and hollow, locked onto Clara with a look of pleading. Clara's hand remained pressed against the glass, her small fingers almost meeting his, separated only by the thin, quivering surface of the mirror. Mrs. Callaway tried to pull her daughter back, but she seemed rooted to the spot, held in place by an invisible force. The medium, sensing the urgency of the moment, whispered instructions to Clara, urging her to tell the sailor he could finally let go, that he no longer needed to stay bound to this world. Clara's lips moved, her voice soft and steady as she spoke. "You don't have to wait here anymore. The sea is calling you back." A sudden, eerie calm filled the room, as if the house itself was listening. The sailor's face softened, a trace of peace passing over his ghostly features. Slowly, he nodded, his hand sliding down the glass as if he were preparing to fade away. The mist around him began to dissolve, leaving only the faint outline of his form. But just as he was nearly gone, a second figure appeared beside him. This one a young woman in a long, flowing dress, her face etched with sorrow and longing. Mrs. Callaway recognized her from old portraits in town, the lost bride who had waited endlessly for her sailor's return. Her hand reached toward him, and their fingers met on the other side of the glass. Then, as though breaking free of a spell, the Callaways all felt a sudden pull, like a deep, resounding heartbeat that echoed through their chests. The entire house shuddered, walls groaning as if resisting something powerful and ancient, and the mirror's glass began to tremble. The sailor and the bride seemed to be moving together, hand in hand, toward a faint light within the depths of the mirror, a light that grew brighter with each passing second. The medium's voice grew firm, her words taking on a rhythm, urging the spirits to cross over. But before they reached the light, Clara gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Clara stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her face pale. They aren't the only ones," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Everyone's eyes shifted to the mirror, where, just beyond the fading forms of the sailor and his bride, darker shapes began to emerge, vague, twisted figures trapped in shadow, their faces obscured but marked with despair. The faint light that had guided the sailor and bride now seemed to falter, flickering as if struggling to withstand an unseen force. The medium's face blanched. "There are more," she murmured, almost to herself. "Lost souls, drawn here by the merchant's desperate rituals, by the tragedy in these walls. They are bound here, too, clinging to the sorrow that permeates this place." One of the shadowed figures moved forward, its form less human and more like a murky haze, yet its presence brought an intense, suffocating dread. A cold whisper echoed from the mirror, unintelligible but chilling, like a plea distorted by anguish and time. The figures pressed closer to the surface, as if sensing an open door and fighting to escape, their wispy hands pressing against the glass, stretching and clawing in desperation. Clara shivered, her eyes still fixed on the mirror. "They don't want to go alone. They need someone to stay with them." Mrs. Callaway grabbed her daughter's shoulders, pulling her back as the figures seemed to press harder, the mirror vibrating violently, cracks beginning to splinter across its surface. The light within dimmed even more, as if these tortured souls were overpowering it, their despair anchoring them to this world. One figure, its face a mask of sorrow and rage, reached out with an outstretched hand, passing through a fissure in the glass, almost breaching into the room. The medium, panicking, held up her amulet and chanted with renewed urgency, attempting to close the portal. But the wailing grew louder, filling the house with a relentless, mournful cry that echoed through every wall, rattling furniture and shaking the very foundation of Ridgeland Hall. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered, teetering on the brink of darkness. The sailor and the bride, now barely visible, looked back one last time, their faces filled with sorrow, as if they, too, were unable to move on without freeing the others. In a final, desperate attempt, the medium raised her voice over the storm, shouting words of release, her amulet glowing faintly. But Clara's voice cut through, small and trembling. "They don't want to leave. Not until someone understands why they're here." And as Clara's words faded, the shadowed figure nearest the glass turned its face toward her, its eyes hollow, yet filled with an intense, haunting awareness. The hollow eyes of the shadowed figure seemed to pierce into Clara's, drawing her into its silent, sorrowful depths. She couldn't look away, as if bound by a weight she didn't understand. In her mind, flashes of images began to appear: a dark, stormy night at sea, the terrifying waves, cries for help that were lost in the roar of the ocean. She could feel their despair, the overwhelming sense of being lost, abandoned. Mrs. Callaway shook her daughter, desperately trying to break the connection. But Clara seemed frozen, her gaze locked with the figures. Her lips moved, barely a whisper, as if speaking to someone only she could see. They're trapped because no one remembers. No one knows what happened to them. Her voice quivered, and a tear rolled down her cheek. They were forgotten, and they can't rest. The medium, visibly shaken but resolute, took a deep breath and knelt beside Clara, placing her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Then we'll listen," she said softly, her eyes closing as she opened herself to the room. "We will bear witness to their story. We will remember so they can finally be free." The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lightening just a bit. The mirror seemed to grow still, the figures within pausing, as if the presence of someone willing to understand was a balm to their restless souls. Clara's eyes grew distant again, and she began to speak, her voice layered with the echo of others, as if she were a vessel for their voices. "They were promised safety," she said, her tone soft and sorrowful. "The merchant's son told them they would make it to Charleston, that they'd reach their families, that the storm was just a test of their endurance. But when the waves swallowed them, they saw the truth that they'd been sacrificed, abandoned to the sea." Her eyes darkened, reflecting the flickering light. "The merchant tried to call them back, not out of guilt, but because he needed them. And now, they're bound here, waiting for someone to remember their suffering." As Clara spoke, the shadows in the mirror shifted, their forms growing clearer, their faces revealing expressions of anguish mixed with hope, as if they sensed that, finally, someone understood. The house groaned, as though it, too, was releasing a long-held breath. The air lightened, and the oppressive cold began to fade. But just as the Callaways felt a glimmer of relief, the medium's amulet flared with a bright, unnatural light, illuminating something darker within the mirror: a hidden figure, lurking in the depths, far more sinister than the others. Its eyes gleamed with a feral, malicious intelligence, and unlike the others, this presence radiated anger, its form twisting and writhing as it began to push forward, through the thinning barrier between the realms. The medium gasped, her voice trembling as she chanted a protective spell. But the entity pressed harder, its hateful gaze locked onto the Callaways, as though it intended to claim something from them. The room's temperature plummeted as the malevolent entity in the mirror surged closer, its twisted face pressed against the glass, leering at the Callaways. Its eyes blazed with a rage that seemed boundless, and a deep, guttural voice began to resonate in the air, filled with contempt and bitterness. The medium's voice faltered, fear seeping into her chants, as she realized that this spirit was different. This was no restless soul yearning for release, but rather a dark force that thrived on pain, anger, and despair. She tightened her grip on the amulet, the glow intensifying as she focused all her energy into creating a protective barrier around the family. Clara, still transfixed by the mirror, trembled but didn't look away. Her soft voice broke the silence again, a courage in her that defied her young age. "You don't have to be angry anymore," she said, her voice wavering. "The others, they're ready to leave. You don't have to keep them here." The figure hissed, recoiling slightly, as if Clara's words had struck something deep within it. Its shadowy form rippled, showing glimpses of what might have once been a man, twisted by years of resentment. In that moment, Clara seemed to understand. "You were the merchant," she whispered. "You wanted to hold on to them, to everyone who was lost. You thought keeping them here would make up for what you did." The figure's face contorted, a mix of anger and sorrow. The Callaways felt an immense pressure in the room, as if the spirit's grief and bitterness were pressing in on them. The medium took a deep breath, steadying herself, and finally spoke with authority. "It's time to let them go." By holding them here, you've trapped yourself in your own torment. The spirit let out a haunting, anguished wail that reverberated through the walls of Ridgeland Hall. The room filled with a whirlwind of shadows, and the mirror began to crack further, splintering under the weight of his agony. One by one, the faces of the other spirits appeared, their expressions softening as they began to separate from the merchant's dark grip, drifting toward the light that had reappeared within the mirror. The merchant's figure wavered, his form losing its harsh edges, replaced with a worn and broken man's face. He looked at Clara, his hollow eyes filled with remorse. For the first time, his expression softened. With a final, shuddering sigh, he released his hold on the others, allowing them to pass through the light. One by one, the spirits faded, their forms becoming ethereal until they disappeared altogether, leaving the merchant alone. He glanced back, the bitterness replaced with a weary acceptance. Slowly, he turned and followed the others, stepping into the light as the mirror's cracks healed, the surface smoothing until it was perfectly clear once more. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and a peaceful stillness settled over the house. The medium let out a breath of relief, the glow from her amulet dimming. She turned to the Callaways, a gentle smile on her face. They're free now. All of them. Clara looked at the mirror, where only her own reflection now gazed back. She felt a strange warmth in her heart, a sense of peace that she couldn't quite explain. Her mother hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes. That night, Ridgeland Hall felt lighter. The weight of centuries-old sorrow finally lifted. The Callaways slept soundly, undisturbed by any whispers or shadows. And from that day forward, no one ever reported strange sounds or apparitions within Ridgeland Hall again. The spirits had finally found their peace, and the house was, at long last, free from its haunting past. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.